Thank you once again all for joining me for this panel about funding and getting funding for TTRPG projects and arts projects more broadly. Let's go around the room and I'd like you to tell everyone who you are, what you've worked on, and what your experience is in either the funding space or the TTRPG space. So we might start with Alexander, because you are first on my screen.
Sure. Thank you for having me. This is a great space to be in. A bit of an interloper, I guess. I don't predominantly work on TTRPGs as much as I would like to. I am in the video game space. I'm working on an video game RPG called Anytown, which I'm excited about. Would not be able to do that job if I hadn't have run my own D&D campaigns for many, many years. So I'm here to talk about funding, though. That's a lot of what I do. I'm across the funding spaces. I keep aware of what different funding might be available in different ways and how to connect, how to make it all work. How to actually go see it as a pathway rather than just firing off different funding applications, hoping for success and then crashing and burning, because even a quick no could be really useful sometimes.
I'm Ben Calatis. I work for City of Melbourne for the libraries there, so I'm the Programs and Partnerships Coordinator. I look at a lot of, projects, supporting people put projects up in library spaces and civic spaces, and my history is mostly in the arts. So, I was a practicing artist for like 15 years and did a bunch of art festivals here in Australia and overseas, and then also was on a bunch of funding panels for art projects across video games, art projects, installations, that sort of stuff.
Hello, my name is V. I'm a full-time TTRPG game developer with Hayley as part of Story Brewers Roleplaying. I think our best-known game is probably Good Society, which is our Jane Austen RPG, but we've done a bunch of other role-playing games as well. I also, in kind of my background is kind of more in the visual side of things. I do a lot of the graphic design on a lot of our projects. And so I think that sort of visual eye for the marketing side of things is something I can cover.
I'm Hayley. I'm the other half of Story Brewers Roleplaying. I have no special skills beyond that, but we've been doing this full-time for about 5 years now, so hopefully we have a few tips from our experience we could share.
First question. So what brought you to the world of TTRPGs or RPGs specifically? And in terms of getting funding for specific projects rather than, just doing it for the passion and the fun. I guess this is probably more directed towards V and Hayley. So I might actually pick on you two first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from the start, we always sort of wanted to make a complete something to share with the world. And I think our very, very first non-full-on games were at least complete in the production process, but were not in the funding. And it was when we wanted to make something be a book, a softcover book, I think The Last was our first game, that we wanted to actually be able to ship and send out into the world on a bigger scale. That's when we started looking at crowdfunding as a way for us to keep things where we are building our own skills but also find the funding before, instead of just making something and then selling it. Crowdfunding is a great way to get in there as a self-publisher. So that's really how we stepped into doing this full time, is from that kind of building up our first crowdfunding campaign. And I think it's very fun. You learn a lot. And I think that's one thing that keeps us in this, is that every time we run through that, every time we make a new game, there's always new things to learn. And that's something I love in my life and what inspires me to keep creating things in my work.
So what I'm hearing is you didn't just quit your full-time jobs and become TTRPG creators full-time from the get-go. You eased into it and then began to build out the projects and the funding from there. Would I be correct in that assumption?
Yeah. I think Hayley can talk about this because Hayley was the first one to jump ship.
Yeah, well, that was more just a matter of the fact that my job at the time was ending and I was like, all right, I'm going to look for a new job, but just in the meantime, just going to be working on crowdfunding Good Society. And then when we finished crowdfunding Good Society, I was like, I'll just make this for a while and see what happens next. Yeah, no, I do agree with what you said. It's definitely a process of learning through doing with crowdfunding. I can't imagine you can read every crowdfunding book in the world and you probably would come in a lot more prepared than we were at the beginning. But I still think that there's a lot of things that are kind of really unique about role-playing games in the way that they crowdfund, and a lot of things that you really don't experience, especially the emotional and sort of the capacity parts of it until you do it. And I definitely think that building up is a great way to go.
Let's talk a little bit more specifically about this particular crowdfunding project that you started with. V, you said it was Good Society that was the first one.
No, the first one we did was called Alas for the Awful Sea, and Good Society was our second Kickstarter. But there was a big step up in between those two, which I think goes to show how much you learn just from doing it one time. So the first one, Alas, was a soft cover, black and white interior only, and it was print on demand. And for Good Society, we did it in full color, and it was offset printing. So we did a whole full print run for that one. So I think when we were doing Alas, that was still when we were still working other jobs full time. And then, as Hayley was mentioning, there was a period where Hayley could dedicate a lot of time on getting the Good Society crowdfund up and running. And then that did really well. So from that point on, we sort of slowly went part-time with our jobs and part-time with the role-playing stuff until it got to the point where we were comfortable going full-time with it.
For those people who aren't familiar with the publishing terms, could you just briefly explain the difference between print on demand and offset publishing?
Yeah, absolutely. So print on demand is when you sort of like have each order printed as it is needed, and so you never have to have stock. It's just printed for that order to be filled, and then it's sent out directly. And there are a bunch of companies that you can contract to do it on that print on demand model. The other way you do it is an offset print run, which tends to be, it can be cheaper, although per unit, because you're doing big print runs of things. And that's when they'll usually have a minimum, whether it's 500 or 1,000, where they're printing in one go, and then you'll have to warehouse that and keep that. That's a whole nother side issue, but then you can send those out around the world. You can send it to distribution centers, and it's not being printed and sent directly to the customer.
Wonderful. And so between those two Kickstarter projects, Alas the Awful Sea and Good Society, what were the main, like obviously the type of printing that you were doing was a big difference, but what were the strategical differences that you made between those two projects? Like what learnings did you take from the first one and then up-leveled it for the second one?
I do think that improving the Kickstarter page was a big part of it. The initial page we did for Alas the Awful Sea was sort of like way back when you could kind of get away a bit more with being like, hey, I've got a crazy idea. Anyone want to just see how we go with it? It's $10. You know, like I feel like the landscape has moved on a lot from that time, and it was sort of moving along with us as we were going. We put a lot more attention in the Good Society page to really crafting a page that will connect with people who read it, who might be the kind of people who would be interested in playing a game, so they could like straight away get into the page and think about like, hey, what's fun about this game? Why would I want to play this? And they can kind of imagine themselves playing the game and imagine the fun that they could have as soon as possible. And I think we wanted to make it evocative, both in terms of what we wrote, but also in terms of the graphical and the visual elements, as well as making it super clear and easy to jump into if you weren't really familiar with a lot of like the TTRPG, terminology and things along those lines. With Good Society, we were aware that we were doing something quite different because there weren't a lot of romance role-playing games around at the time. And so I think inviting people to like put aside a little bit of what they might think and sort of creating another pathway for them to walk down when they're imagining themselves imagining themselves playing the game. It was like a really important part of what we were trying to do. Whereas with Alas, it was very much just like, here's the pitch of the game, here's the front cover picture, here's the character archetypes, you want it or not, So it kind of moved on a bit there.
Beautiful. So thinking in terms of those assets, Hayley, you've sort of highlighted a lot of like the copywriting aspects, but in terms of like the visual assets, what did you bring in that was different from Alas the Awful Sea? So was it, you mentioned that there was a cover for the Alas the Awful Sea, but what else did you bring in for Good Society that you think made a big difference on that page?
Yeah, absolutely. The visuals was something we immediately knew after the first campaign is so, so important. Even more so now, as Haley was saying, the landscape has changed. That is, I would say, like even more important. And because we were able, it was a second project, we kind of had reinvested a bit of our sort of like money from our first Kickstarter to just upfront more art pieces. So I believe we came into the Good Society Kickstarter with a lot more images, a lot more art. We'd already talked to artists and sorted that out. And I think we also came in and I'd made like a quick start that was properly laid out, so people could also see what it would look like. So having all of that prepared before the Kickstarter, which is like pretty standard these days, is important. And it was one of the things that definitely changed between our first two attempts.
And what do you think, like now that the landscape has changed since funding Good Society, what do you think are the benchmark crowdfunding strategies that people need to have when launching a crowdfunding page of any sort nowadays?
I think you can get like I think it depends. It depends what you're targeting, like how much you're wanting to get out of it. I think that realistically, the first few Kickstarters, you can definitely build. Like once we had a bit of an audience, it's always easier to go and like have your fans and for consecutive Kickstarters to be a bit more consistent. So depending on what you're like targeting, I think you can get away with a little or like the full works, right? But you might need other strategies if you don't have as much polish. I think that unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know. I think the landscape where it is now is that there is a high amount of premium in like things looking slick, things looking really polished. And that's kind of hard sometimes when it's your first project. It's definitely something where we were able to get away with it on Kickstarter these days. But nowadays I feel like if you're practicing that element of your marketing and design process, that there are ways to sort of do like either an itch.io PDF release and kind of go have an alpha version of that game first and use that as a marketing tool to draw interest in your game before and for you to practice, in fact, putting together a really slick looking product before it actually goes into the big crowdfunding version where you do have all of those like now they have like animated elements on those Kickstarter pages and they have like all sorts of things. Now it's pretty standard to also have a lot of video assets, be they actual plays of your game or reviews already or how to plays. Like so there's all of these other things now that if you look at any big Kickstarter pages, you'll start to see them. So I think there is an approach now where you go do a smaller alpha release, do iterations of that before you hit your crowdfunding stage.
Yeah, and just on that, like I think a big part of it is that ultimately what you're trying to do either way is capture people's attention and form a connection with your game. And, one way of doing that is having like very engaging, very polished visuals that, lead people straight into this imaginative world that they can jump straight into that way. But if an alternative to doing that is through that process of continued iterations where you build up a community who invested and interested in your game, and that they will start to tell other people about it. And as long as you have somewhere a home base that is accessible, which contains like the things that people need to know about your game and a way to get involved, you can really like build that over time, and you can kickstart it when you have the confidence that you already know there are people out there who are going to be interested and who are going to go forward with it.
Do you have any advice for people setting funding goals or rewards, that sort of thing? Are there any mistakes that people should avoid or traps when it comes to those two things in particular?
I laugh a little bit because one of the biggest traps I think is in the stretch goals section of project, because it's very, very easy to get carried away with that section if you're not careful and either being promising too much or just like not taking into account how long that will take you to do as well as doing the base game, and that's slowing down the whole process for you, because one of the hardest things I think emotionally when you do have a crowdfunding situation is the due dates involved in that, and trying to keep everything to a timeline that's going smoothly for you and that's not really stressing you out too much. So being able to scope out your stretch goals realistically is important. And a big pitfall is promising too much in that section.
I think the other major pitfall people fall into is probably shipping. Shipping is hella expensive. Like, there's no other way to put it. And especially if you are doing an offset print run of something, you really need to think about what the shipping costs are going to be in advance, not just from where you're sending it from to people, but also to get it from where it's going to be made to where you're sending it from. And then you also need to think about the fact that, like, your crowdfunding platform is taking a cut of whatever you're charging on that as well. Or if you're using a pledge manager, that's also, going to be taking a cut of all the money that's going through that. And then also shipping goes up every 3 months. Surprise, it's more expensive. So people, I think, chronically underestimating the cost of shipping is something that people do. We did it for sure in our earlier Kickstarters and really have tried to correct for that now. And that can be I've seen in Kickstarters that, during the spike that happened during COVID, because they had so little flex in their shipping budgets, that get to the point where they had to say, actually, hey, we actually need everyone to pay extra money for shipping or we can't afford to ship the game. And that's not a position that you ever want to be in. So yeah, I think realistically working out really how much it really is going to cost you for shipping, not how much you think maybe it will cost you if you kind of can squeeze under the 1 kilo mark. It's better to get people to have an understanding of the true cost than it is to spring it on them later, or else to be in the position of having already charged them and not been able to cover it.
Yeah, because price wise, people the price points for games, you got to sort of back yourself, because you don't think that you will just lower it a little bit and that will be the thing that'll make people buy your game, because it's much better to charge fairly for yourself and for your own margins, and kind of put your faith in figuring out what is the most fun about your game and truly marketing that game, because that's what will get people to buy it, not that it's $5 cheaper. That's I think why it's important to know the numbers for yourself.
Solid business advice for every artsy creator out there. And on that segue, I think we might pivot to sort of diversifying funding streams. What avenues have you seen TTRPG creators use, or just generally wider the arts community use in order to secure funding? And how might newcomers explore these particular options and avenues? Where might they look for these sorts of opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, what have I observed? Everything, everyone. There is no stone left unturned. And still, though, I think part of the problem actually isn't what funding is available so much as how do you find out about it? Where do you go? Who do you talk to? For TTRPG in particular, there is funding available at every level. The only issue then is how do you actually connect with it? You'll have local councils who usually have arts funding between 2,000 and 10,000, depending on how fancy your council is. And then you've got the state agencies, depending on where you are, which kind of program you can go through. And then, of course, you've got the federal funds as well. I know that the Arts Council, now Creative Australia, are very excited about this space. It was in the Revive National Cultural Policy, the inclusion in games, board games, TTRPGs, which is really great to see. So the advice there is to talk to everybody. And if it says arts funding, that doesn't exclude TTRPG. Partly because it is this wonderful intersection, right, of literature and performance and obviously storytelling from different mediums. The other exciting thing about funding opportunities too at the moment is there's so much emphasis, especially after COVID, of bringing communities together. So you can think about things of there's funding for development, sure, if you're developing your own game, but there's also funding just for actually running games, if you can actually show that it's actually bringing communities together in a meaningful way.
100%. I totally agree. I think it's also about understanding what you're trying to get out of it too. So I would say from councils, one thing a lot of councils are starting to do now, including City of Melbourne, is quick response grants. So quick, fast responses. Basically, you can submit whenever and just get a quick grand or two out of them just for a project on the fly that you're working on. And a lot of councils are jumping into that space as well. When it comes to Creative Australia now, which is awesome, and I was a big fan of the new cultural policy that they put out too, because it was actually speaking about Australian industry more broadly. It wasn't just focusing on traditional arts, which was a big change. And I would say, look, Creative Australia is really good in terms of if you want to look at business investment or arts business investment, they've got really good funds there for you to do that, and project focused funds as well. So traditionally, Creative Australia used to focus very strongly on new work, new projects all the time, but they have been actually starting to look more about what does it mean for you to have an arts business? What do you need to invest in it? Pitch an idea for them. And then I would say more for state funding, they tend to still be pretty project focused, to be honest, from my experience and looking at a lot of their funding rounds, recently. But again, you've got more avenues than just the publishing industry. Exactly what Alexander said is like performance. You've got publishing as well, but then you can also talk about what does it mean to have a business and make a publishing industry and those sorts of things too. And I also think the video games industry has a lot to share, particularly when it looks at what does it mean to not just get your product to an Australian audience, but what does it mean to actually broaden out into an international audience. And that is something that a lot of arts funders are interested in, trying to break the cultural bubble of, just for Australians. It's actually trying to think about what does Australia mean culturally within the global context of the creative industry as well. The only ones I would add to that too, though, is the ACF, the Australian Cultural Fund. If you're looking for if you want to add crowdfunding as well or another avenue to do it, the one good thing about the Australian Cultural Fund is if you want to get into philanthropy money, it's tax deductible money when people donate to that. So, you can look at, going to businesses and potential philanthropy sponsors to look at, putting in a donation that's got actual deduction behind it as well. And that can actually really help with getting people behind it. And again, with diversification, there's no harm with going with all of them. You submit a grant for a project with Australia Cultural Fund, with Creative Australia. You say, hey, we're going to work on this project. This much of it, we're going to focus on crowdfunding. This much of it's going to help us with these other elements, including paying ourselves as well, which is really important when you're submitting a grant, is to make sure that you say you're going to pay yourself. It's super important. And then also do your crowdfunding. And then you could also do the Australian Cultural Fund and also do another thing there too. So it's really just making sure you've got multiple streams of revenue and possibilities coming in at once.
Don't just stick to the arts funding either. If you're serious about making this a serious concern, if you're wanting to export, then there's all sorts of business programs. They are very boring people to deal with, but once you're able to help them understand what you're trying to do, all they want to do is help you. And again, that can be at a local council level or a state level with like small business funds. And then there's also federal level, there's small business as well, especially if you're exporting, right? At the moment, games is hot. Austrade has no idea what games are, but they're very enthusiastic about trying to help you connect with your audience around the world.
In terms of like writing good pitches we've heard a little bit about like writing a good Kickstarter or crowdfunding page, but what makes a good pitch for any kind of project if you're looking for any sort of government funding?
Grants, I think, look, writing a grant does take planning, but before you write a grant, always call them, always reach out to them first. It not only do they get a sense of who you are and what you're about, and also can really give you great advice on like, hey, what does actually your funding application look like in relation to what we can offer? Like they're public servants. Their job is to make sure public funding gets funding out there to creative projects. So they're invested to have a chat with you and figure out what you're trying to do and how you can, go about applying for funding as well. So have a look at the contact, always call them, always email first, check in, make sure you've got plenty of time, try not to rush everything in the last week of submission. And then once you have a chat, just break down the key criteria really of what the grant might be. It'll probably say something along the lines of, how is this work unique, or how does this, what are the elements of it that is, sharing towards an audience? Are there elements of accessibility to it? Like there will be really clear criteria there. So being able to look at that criteria, ask the questions directly about how, what does it look like to meet those forms of criteria? And then literally just go through, the application, highlight all the keywords that relate to the criteria, and then throw them back into the application and just make sure it's really strong. But always talk to them, because otherwise you've got no context about how it's going to be read or how it's actually going to be viewed behind it as well. And that goes, from my experience, from pretty much any grant scenario. The only other thing too is to be aware of language. So say, for example, like if you're pitching a business grant, you wouldn't necessarily talk about community, you talk about customers. If you're pitching to a arts audience, you're talking about audience rather than necessarily community. So it's being able to know the interchangeable relationships of those terms to be able to really sell, how you're going to build your audience and your community and your customers as a base as well.
Yeah, it boggles my mind how often people just don't read the criteria, or they try and read, they overthink it, I think, and they try and put too much. VA responded really strongly what you were saying before about crowdfunding, of overpromising. I think people, when they go for arts funding, they feel like they need to promise the planet, otherwise they won't necessarily, get a look in. And so then they end up making a really other common mistake that I see all the time when I'm assessing funding is, what does it actually mean to you and to your business, if there is one, right? Because especially if it's for arts funding, they're interested in audience, they're interested in community, but also they need to understand what the value is to you beyond the actual inherent value of the project, right? You can't assume that just by saying, I am doing a thing, that they're necessarily going to see the value in it. And a lot of people, especially in the game space, both video games and TTRPG, are a bit afraid of talking about what it personally means to them, not just whatever creativity goes into the project, but what it might also mean to just have, $5K to get from one step to the next, or maybe a bit more money to actually go overseas and to an audience. And similarly, when you're looking at business funding as well, talk specifically about what you're trying to achieve. What is the value to yourself in that? Because a lot of the time they won't understand the full context. A lot of the time, even in arts funding, you won't necessarily get a dedicated TTRPG person assessing. So what they're looking for is actually what the value is and what that value kind of means to you as a person.
The only thing I'd just add to that is partners are powerful in a grant situation. So say, for example, you're working towards a project for PAX, having PAX as a potential partner as, hey, this is where we're going to show the work. This is something like a milestone we're going to aim for, and they're on board as a partner. Having partners does help give weight and depth to your proposals as well. Even if it's a fringe festival thing, even if it's some sort of game conference or something like that, just having that partner there helps the funders and also the assessors really look at and go, okay, I can see a tangible outcome here. Particularly if it's project-based work, if it's business funding wise, it's not too important as long as you can talk about, how you're aiming towards something and you're working with people to help you progress your business and maybe looking at mentors or something like that. But with arts projects, to say, straight up, hey, we're going to aim towards this milestone. This is going to be an outcome. It's a major festival, or it's going to have a lot of audience there for us to be able to have it there. We're going to have your branding everywhere of whatever funding you got, to showcase that, yes, you funded our work and, you're investing in the Australian art scene or cultural scene. That's also really important as well.
So what I'm getting out of that little discussion is two key takeaways. Ben, you were talking about how these public servants, they want to, if you reach out to them, they will actively try to help you to make a better grant. So in my mind, it was I think people have this image of public servants sort of trying to hoard the government money and not wanting to give it away, sort of like dragons that are no, don't you come into our lair. And I just love the image of, no, that's completely backwards. They are actively trying to give it away. You've just got to write a good enough grant proposal to make that happen. And they will actively help you do that.
As a public servant, I am not a dragon, I promise.
I will say every library person has always been so into TTRPGs and so helpful.
Oh yeah, totally. I think it's interesting in that space too, because you look from a library point of view, we're a public space and we're there to support, everyone, including the cultural scene and in the spaces that we use. But from our point of view, it is a beautiful marriage of, writing, literacy, people getting together and problem solving, social skills. Like Alexander was saying before, dealing with issues around well-being and social isolation. I genuinely think that after COVID, TTRPGs have shown that to be a form of supporting those sort of well-being aims as well. So yeah, 100%. Like libraries of them, but I think wider wise, from my own experience of talking to other people in the industry, TTRPGs are coming front and center, particularly in terms of publishing and engagement and theatre and all those things. So, yeah.
How important do you think it is to build a community, not only of fans, but of connections to help you, I guess, get funding for TTRPGs?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's vital. I mean, partly also too, if you're developing your own TTRPG and it comes from some lived experience with a community that shares that lived experience, there is such an emphasis on that at the moment, because obviously TTRPG is very dominated by fantasy and sci-fi, and obviously there's a place for that. But if it's coming from a more kind of authentic source in terms of lived experience, then that can very much go in your favour towards working with government, getting funding agencies and so on, because they're automatically seeing the value in the connection between you and the wider community, not just in the development, because they're obviously seeing themselves, but then one can assume the game will then be played as well as a way of actually widening exposure to that kind of culture. And all of that is good stuff for the funding side.
Community is a very supportive thing to have around you when you're creating role-playing games for reasons like outside of funding. We really value the community that we've built, and we actively try to expand that community, less because we are aiming to like use it for commercial purposes in terms of funding, but more because role-playing games are inherently a medium that is meant to be, for the most part, I know there are exceptions to this, but meant to be played, and having a community engage in iterations of the game that you're creating is actually going to improve it considerably, and also sharpen the pitch of that game and bring out the things that other people really see and really like in that game. And so even though there's not the direct link between like, community equals dollar, I believe that community contributes in that they make your game better, and they help crystallize what's great about your game, so that when you get to the crowdfunding stage or application stage, you have that, to put front and center. How your game can connect with people, and you can really utilize that in the funding process.
Look, momentum is a powerful thing. And, if you want to build momentum, people build momentum, I did a lot of travel overseas, mostly working in the sort of makerspace, Fab Lab scene and tech community scene. And, seeing what groups of creatives and innovators and people coming together to share ideas openly, freely, getting feedback, being able to, look at each other's opportunities and share possibilities or opportunities, all of it builds momentum. And, there's nothing else but good that can come from that. I think one thing that's interesting about the community space at the moment is the role of communities sort of changed a little bit based on where we're at, I guess, from like an industry point of view, like Twitch community, like the whole sort of parasocial side of things of community is a little bit different now to what it used to be, I found. But nonetheless, like having people that you can talk to, connect with, share ideas, and also look at, furthering each other's, support, and looking at opportunities or sharing, hey, I saw this thing the other day, here's a link to it. Those sorts of things, yeah, everything's just really good from it. And really helps to sort of also build a broader understanding amongst everyone, because it means we all get to look at new ideas and ways of looking at it ourselves too.
Yeah, no, that's really great. And what I'm hearing out of that is that there might be two different ways in which we're using the word community here, and that might have been an error on my end in terms of phrasing the question. So I think that there is the sort of creator to creator sort of like peer community, or creator to, organization body, as you were mentioning before, Ben, with PAX, sort of like that sort of like horizontal relationship, whereas there's also the creator to their audience relationship, which leads more into like the the parasocial sort of stuff, but is a more vertical, I guess, relationship. So I think in terms of I'd love to hear you've spoken a little bit about the peer-to-peer, sort of like the horizontal creator-to-creator, like having that community of people around you. I do want to sort of like pass out a little bit more because I think the TTRPG community is, it's not huge. And a lot of the people who are, in the community are also creators, as well as consumers of, or, audience of these particular products. Do you see that there is a big difference between those two types of community, or is the relationship not as, split?
So this is part of the issue that I have working in this space, right? It's like, I don't know how many people play TTRPGs in Australia. We don't have good data on how many people are actually playing. Like you say, the role-playing community is small, but if we're defining it as players as well as creators, then I would say it can't be. Like, I know I'm a nerd, and so my community is probably more likely to be playing TTRPG, and yet I see it everywhere. Like, I literally the other day, randomly, a friend of a friend came up to me and said, some drag queens want to play an RPG because they've seen it on a thing. Can you run a game for me, right? And like, that's I don't know, 6 degrees of separation of nerdness there, and yet it's happening. So I think part of the issue that we have is like, we don't have really good visibility on exactly what player community at least looks like in Australia, other than around the particular hubs, like what V and Haley are doing with their community here and the different events that are going on. But definitely now, I think it's going way out into the wider population more than it ever has before. So I think maybe the next ask for funding might be to actually find out who is actually playing RPGs.
Can we fund a survey, please?
Please,
sure.
And what games they're playing. What games are they playing?
Right, I have a meeting with the Australian Council in a couple of weeks. I'll bring it up. I like how this is going from a panel into...
we would love to know that.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
No, I think it's getting bigger. It's mainstream. My parents, when they explain it to other parents what we do for a living, they say stranger things now. Like it's out there. So I think there are a lot of people playing, and I would love to know what games people are playing. And I think that there is more of an appetite nowadays as well for people to try things beyond just the biggest games that are out there. And they are looking at other more independent games, which is great for us. Yay. Like, people all have their weird little story inside of them that they just want to tell. And I think that's wonderful. We've got the internet now that people can find the game that kind of the game designs closer to the things they want. And I think that is one of the joys in working in such a TTRPG, such an inherently story machine. Everyone is like encouraged to be creative and encouraged to tell their own stories, which is why that blurring between like, are they peers? Are they, that happens so much on our Discord. I never even think about it in that way because everyone is making their own thing or everyone is running their own game and everyone is telling their own stories. So it feels, it's different because you're playing with them.
Yeah. It's sort of like, it's a weird reception of the text, I guess, because there are these I don't know, like from a literary perspective, like, people read a text or consume a text and then, they bring all their own biases and interpretations to it. But with TTRPGs, there's like they then co-create with that experience, which is, phenomenal and does turn them into creators, whether they're, creating, drawings of their characters or their own stories or their own little voices, whatever. Like there's definitely that layer. Going back to what you're saying about the cultural zeitgeist of like it being, strange, like people went to Stranger Things or the Dungeons and Dragons movie. Like, there's so many
Baldur's Gate.
So many points. Baldur's Gate. There are so many big points of reference that people can now point to. Do we think that this has an impact on, say, looking for grant opportunities? Is it worth pointing out just, how much of a big boom the TTRPG scene is currently undergoing? And do we think that having some sort of, I guess, firm data around it would be helpful for those sorts of, applications and whatnot to sort of like get it through to people?
I guess I can talk from a data. Look, I deal a lot in data. But really data, like how data is being used and the purpose for it, particularly from a funding point of view, is changing, to be honest. Like old school days, it was all about super quantifiable data. This is what the consumer reach is. This might be what return on investment is, all that sort of stuff. I don't know. Like if you look at the arts industry it's been trying to sell this stat thing that, hey, we're better than sports. More people go to arts than, the footy, this sort of thing. But really, I think as someone who's worked in the industry, I do think that it's helped a bit, but I don't really think that data has necessarily supported the arts industry as much as they hoped it has. I think it really comes down to cultural purpose. And I do think that if you've got a really strong understanding of like what you're trying to do and how that helps, Australia, how it helps the industry, how it helps people, how it's building investment, because it's super popular doesn't matter really at the end of the day. What matters is that the outcomes are strong and that you can make sure that message is really clear. And things like qualitative data to talk about, hey, what people have said from trying it out, having quotes from a journalist or something like that, or being able to sort of be really clear about how does it make people feel, or have a story about an outcome of what does it mean. Those things are becoming more powerful now, particularly within a funding context, more so than the quantifiable stuff.
I mean, so one of the examples that was in the cultural policy, national cultural policy, was PVI Collective in WA, and what they basically did was run. It's a TTRPG, but it's basically like a pub quiz disguised. Sorry, it's a narrative investigation of like how do we consume food, how do we make decisions about where our food comes from, but disguised as a pub quiz, right? It's a whole group role-playing experience in a pub doing that. And so, a lot of the language about that is not, yay, there's 200 people that came to this thing over whatever. It was more about the fact that at the beginning, people were somewhat ignorant, not prone to being reflecting on making their food choices. By the end, though, they were, facing the consequences of their choices in a really kind of profound kind of way. And so, what is valuable for everyone, whether it's creators looking at that as a case study or whether it's funders, is that kind of impact. The fact that these people felt something, that they've actually come out of their bubble to actually either think or learn or, experience something that they otherwise wouldn't. So I'd say numbers still count. We still need to make business cases in a whole bunch of different ways because some people do believe in trickle-down nonsense. But, that needs to just work alongside the qualitative stuff that we've been talking about where, man, we're making people feel things. Like, that's so important to the fabric of society.
And hopefully that's a more comfortable zone for our audience. It's like we're sharing people's stories and experiences of these games and of these projects. So awesome. I have some questions around budgeting and planning, but I don't know if that's really, really boring.
For the grants, you'll have to prepare a budget. That is important. That's the only thing.
Yeah, I think it is important. And we sort of touched on it earlier because screwing up your budgeting is very stressful for the crowdfunding phase also.
Yeah, things too, like pay yourself. You have to pay yourself. Like it used to be in the past that, people would be a bit grumpy about people paying themselves, but obviously now we realize that people need to actually pay themselves no matter what industry they're in. So that's really important. The other thing too
I've heard about grants being denied because people didn't ask for enough money.
100%.
They didn't pay themselves enough money.
That's literally what I was going to say next, actually. It's a bit like what V and Haley were saying earlier about budgeting and costs and all that kind of stuff. As an assessor, I have had to say no because people have not actually put in enough money. Don't think that by putting in a lower bid, you'll actually have a greater chance of getting funding. You won't, because the criteria is about viability. Does it match up between budget and what you're trying to execute? And please add a contingency. We are not going to get angry at you if you add 15% because stuff happens, like your postage goes up every 3 months and we don't exactly know how, especially with current climate. So, be safe. We want you to be safe and secure in your creation. And we're, as an assessor, happy to fund that. And the funding bodies are very happy to encourage that as well.
So stop role-playing the starving artist and start role-playing the sustainable artist.
Yeah, definitely just with paying yourself too, please look at the industry standards when you're looking to put in the budget bit. So I would probably say, like if you look at Writers Australia or Writers Victoria, they've got, listing fees on there for publishing and writing and all those things. NAVA, the National Artists, I don't know, it's like the sort of like an association union / thing for artists. If you go to the NAVA website, they've got a full list of all of the the artist standards in terms of pay as well.
So NAVA?
Yes. Yeah. So please research that first and put in, what you think the hours you're going to do and pay yourself based on those standards. Because again, send it over to Alexander and they'll look at it and be like, you're going to pay yourself $2,000 for this thing? Yeah, I don't think so.
It boggles my mind sometimes. You look at the budget and it's like, this is actually below minimum wage. So technically this is illegal to fund you for that. Yeah, the Australian Writers Guild also has rates, not specifically for TTRPG, but it is a space that we're looking at. I'm a member of I'm on an interactive committee for them too. And if you are a member, they have an industrial team. So even if they don't have it written down somewhere, there's an industrial team responsible for finding out that figure for you. And I would love to see the guild ask that question more often, because as a guild that looks after theatre as well as video games, I think it also makes sense that TTRPG people might find value in the guild.
The only thing I'd probably add too is there's also opportunities around like connecting with auspicing organizations. So say, for example, you want a bit of help with your budget stuff and it's your first time, you just got your ABN and you're not sure what to do with it and you want to go for a $50,000 grant. I would recommend talking to an auspice company. So basically you go to them and you say, hey, look, I'm looking for this grant and this is my rough idea and I'm going to put in this submission. They can actually put themselves forward so that they'll take, I think it's like a 10%, 5 to 10% cut sometimes of the total fee, but they'll actually sort of sit there as a protection mechanism to make sure that, you're doing your money right. They can make sure all the budget and stuff is divvied out properly. And it also helps legitimize, new formed or just quickly emerge sort of businesses and artists and individuals as well, just to sort of give a little bit of like reassurance as well to the funding body to be like, okay, it might be their first time, we're not sort of sure, but hey, this auspice here will sort of keep them in check.
Yeah, they can help with the tax stuff as well, because getting big chunks of money all at once can be a little bit scary on the tax side. Either an auspice organization will help that because they'll just pay you, as you need it to be paid, or get an accountant. They're not that expensive, and the reduction in stress is well worth every dollar.
I just made Haley do all our accounting.
So for those who might not know, could you just briefly explain what an auspice organization is and how they differ from a standard accountant or whatever? Ben, you've sort of flagged this already, but just for those who might not know that technical term.
Oh, I'm trying to remember the technical term. An accountant will basically do your tax and help you work it out, but the auspice itself, they'll receive the money on your behalf, and then they pay it out to you, essentially. That's what like Alexander was saying. And they also will essentially manage the tax side of things sort of on your behalf, but they won't do your personal tax, though. They'll manage the project budget. They'll make sure that you're on track and you meet your milestones as needed. And also, depending on the type of grant you get, like there's some grants that, like if you're going for a 100K grant, an auspice can sort of be quite helpful from like a procurement point of view and all of those things when you're going for like tenders and stuff like that as well. So it's sort of more like a business, like a money management business to help sort of divvy out money from a grant, and they can provide advice around, supporting you with the tax and those sort of things, but they won't do what an accountant does, which is actually do your tax.
Yeah, because if you're an individual and you get 50K into your account, the tax office will treat that like income unless you're able to specify otherwise. So an auspice organisation could be great because they'll hold on to the 50K. They'll pay you per month whatever wage you feel or need or whatever expenses are required as well. So, yeah, it can be really handy to do that. But again, talk to an accountant anyway to try and work that stuff out because, there's no need to be scared of this stuff. And I know that's part of the reason why some people just don't go near this funding space. And it's just try not to be too scared of it. These people also want to help you.
Wonderful. Haley and V, did you have anything to add to the sort of like the budgeting and planning side of things?
I would say that it is really worthwhile, like contacting manufacturers or printers, or get estimates and quotes for as many things as you possibly can ahead of time, especially for crowdfunding, so that you can properly price your game. And again, don't, like, as exactly as V said before, when it comes to pricing, like, don't feel like you have to squish your margins really, really tightly, because that margin is going to be paying for, things that you can't even think of, things you cannot think. Did you know you have to pay for an ISBN? Yes, they must be paid for. Things like that you won't even realize you need to pay for them before you start going through. So I think that's a good idea. I think if you're really hot on paying yourself a fair wage, maybe go for a grant, because when you start crowdfunding, it's probably not going to happen straight away. Usually crowdfunding is going to give you the capital that you need to buy a lot of copies of your game. If you're running offset, or, if you're doing a digital version, like, create your game. And I'm like, it would be usual for you to get some amount of proceeds from that, but you wouldn't expect to get an amount that's anywhere comparable to the amount of effort that you're going to put in making a game at that stage. Really, crowdfunding is often more of a business venture where you're undertaking to sell that product over a long period of time. And that's the way you intend to pay yourself. Whereas, as from what I can understand, grants are something where maybe you do come out at the end with something that you can further commercially utilize, but also, you're being paid for the process of doing something as well, which is great.
Yeah, I see a perfect world where you could go for a small business grant from your either state or federal government to pay your wage, while crowdfunding perhaps pays for your project, at least when you're starting out, perhaps.
Wonderful. Alrighty. So moving on to industry trends. Did anyone have anything they wanted to say about changing markets? We have sort of talked a little bit about, changes in crowdfunding and in expectations of what you need to produce for, like, a landing page, as well as, what people expect out of the end product. And we've also sort of talked about changing trends in, applying for grants, about how the quantitative and qualitative difference has changed over time. I guess the focus has changed over time for that. But are there any other industry trends that you're seeing in the funding area that you think are important to highlight?
In the sense that, like, there are now organizations which you wouldn't typically consider like TTRPG makers, but they are using the principles of TTRPG to develop whatever it is that they might be working on. So there's an organization called Counterpilot in Brisbane, another organization called S1T2 in Sydney, and they are amalgamation of performance and technology. But usually what underpins all of that activity is TTRPG kind of sensibility, skills, and experience. So a lot of the time, if you look at the prototypes for the projects, they are literal TTRPGs. They get around a table and hash it out. And then they look at ways that the technology can then kind of enhance. So that's another opportunity for funding. If you want to take your TTRPG in a innovative way somehow with technology, it is also something that is that people are excited about at the moment.
So hearing business and tech TTRPGs are on the rise.
Absolutely. But I mean, it doesn't need to be like, super crypto AI blah. It could literally be just, surround sound systems, projection, or like what PVI did in, with the taking a pub quiz, but turning that into an RPG where people get to talk about food. There's so many different ways that you can use the skills that you've got in TTRPG to be a bit entrepreneurial, I guess. And that's also another way that you'll stand out, perhaps, if you're going for funding.
Any other emerging trends?
I mean, IPs are big in TTRPGs. Every IP wants a TTRPG version these days. Not my personal thing, but it is something we've seen more as an industry trend.
Well, you don't have Netflix knocking on your door? Come on. Surely that's the next step.
I mean, Netflix are making series from RPGs too these days, so it's getting there.
I guess that's probably a side conversation about, maybe there's going to be a rise in jobs and freelance opportunities for people inside the space.
One thing that is legitimately exciting and interesting is that there are these things like relief bundles in the TTRPG space across, like, they usually do them on itch.io or other platforms like that, where you can bundle in your game. And maybe this is one you've crowdfunded already. So, this is also another way of getting more funding for the game that you already made, where you're including it in a bundle and it gets sold for some amount. Sometimes some of these is all of the proceeds then get donated to a cause or something, but some of them are for they will split it between the creators who contributed to that bundle, so you do get some payout as well. So there's like fun things like that you can get involved with. That's also fun beyond doing that, because you're like involved with other creators and getting to know people and all of that sort of thing as well.
And having a positive impact on the world with the causes that you
that's
care
also
about.
Great.
Yeah.
Yep.
The only thing I would add to that is, I think, look, this is something that, I don't know if it happens as much as it used to, but it happened a lot in the early days of a lot of like tech space, particularly where you develop a new thing and everyone's really protective about their IP and they're really, don't want to share, and they see anyone that joins a trend as a competition. I think just from my own experience of seeing that happen, everyone coming together to join a trend doesn't make you a competitor against each other. It actually broadens, that aspect of the industry. And it also helps broaden an audience too, because to be honest, like if you can build a bigger audience, you're actually building a bigger base to sell to. Whereas if you stay super niche and you only go to the same people every time, they're only going to buy your thing so many times. But if you come together with other people and don't necessarily have a we're in competition mindset and actually look about, hey, how do we broaden our audience overall? That's good for everybody. And I think that's one of the beauties of trends is trends in a way is about audience building and getting your message out there to a broader audience, because you're building upon popularity and then you're broadening what that understanding of popularity is. And doing that work means that you're going to have a sustainable future together, and I think ultimately that should be the outcome.
I love that. It reminds me that it probably is the saying, a rising tide lifts all ships. And I think that's very true of trends. Throwing it open to the floor, if there was one piece of advice that you could give to anyone aspiring to get funding for their projects in the TTRPG space, what would that one piece of advice be?
I'm going to be cheeky and refer to what Alexander said before. I think really understanding that your skills are broad, the skills you build in this industry and the work that you do isn't just for one particular product. It could be helpful to a video game designer. It could be helpful to someone else doing a production cycle on other projects as well. And I think as a creative person or a person that's trying to build a creative sort of business, understanding that what you do has use broadly everywhere, and being able to understand how you can help lots of different creative projects come together is really important. And the role that community has in terms of helping you, understand what's needed out there in the industry and finding ways to come to that and share your expertise and also spread the word of what you're doing and those things. I think overall that's just going to do really well for yourself, but also the industry itself.
Right next to that, I would also say, just please talk to people. Just, nerd out with people. And I'm talking right across the board. Talk to funding agencies, go to things. I mean, I'm an introvert, so it pains me a little bit to say this. But I think every successful relationship that I built, it's certainly never come from, have I got a deal for you? And rather it was, a sharing a passion or interest or curiosity in things as well. I think we're in this space because we're naturally curious people. And so, that you should share that curiosity with people, ask them what they're doing, be curious then about why, what is their passion. Bring a bit of your weird too, don't hide it too much. Obviously don't go super weird out of the gate. Unless you're at a really boring party. I actually find it really useful sometimes to just be super weird, because then you attract the weird people and it's better. But generally speaking, show a bit of the weird, what you're bringing to this space. It's a bit like what I was talking about when you're doing funding applications. What does it mean to you to be, telling stories these ways and helping other people tell stories as well?
Yeah, I think if you're a creator, seeking funding for a project that you have and you want to really bring it to life, one of my biggest advice is it's two things. First, believe in yourself, because everything starts from your own love for yourself and your own belief in what you're doing. And if you aren't so good like that, like me, you can use someone else as a crutch. Have someone who believes in you, and use that for a while until you can project it confidently yourself. But it is actually really, really important to spend that time with your own self-confidence and self-belief. Because when you are, which is point two, starting to design this pitch for your game, and I don't like, sometimes you get lost in all this like sales pitch, you got to sell them on it, but it's actually like just finding what it is that you're making, what is resonant about what you are making with other people, and talking to other people so that you can discover that thing, and then so that you can speak passionately with self-belief and self-confidence about those resonant things. That's really going to be what starts the whole journey for you. Yeah, so that's my one.
I guess if I was going to say one thing that hasn't been said already, it's probably just do something and then work it out later. Because you're not going to lose out from it. I suppose, especially in the realm of, itch or crowdfunding, or even just in games in general, like make a game and head down to a convention and run it and chat to people, and or put your game up on itch or whatever it is. Do the thing that you would like to do, and you will learn from that experience, both in the process and what you get back from other people. And there is nothing better to help you do the thing better than doing the thing.
Wonderful. And I love that there is a clear through line to all of that, which is just building connections with other people and building those genuine connections with others, not sort of going into it with a salesy mindset, but sharing your weirdness and reaching out to people who want to help you secure funding, and sort of like finding that I guess that resonant thing inside your game that resonates with other people, as well as just trying something very quickly on itch, or creating something very quickly and taking it down to a convention and just connecting with people over that. There's that very clear through line with all of this that I think is definitely worth highlighting, and I think it is a beautiful note to end on.